Hello, this is Dr. Kevin Garrison in a fourth video on a lecture series of writing and technology. So let's quickly recap what we've talked about in the last three lectures and push forward with a new idea. So the past three lectures have argued for three thesis statements. The first one is that technology is an ideology, the second is technology is an efficient evolutionary process, and the third is that technology grows autonomously. Now, when you combine all these three ideas together, we conclude something that I stated in the previous lecture, which is that the substantive model or theory of technology is the one that I believe is most accurate for understanding technological advance. So the substantivist perspective, summarized, really looks something like this. It says, we shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. This quote is attributed to Marshall McLuhan incorrectly. He never actually wrote this, but in popular discourse, he is the author of that line. But it's a good example of what we're talking about in these previous three lectures. We create, and then it comes back to quote-unquote bite us on the butt, or it comes back to make us deal with the unintended consequences, or it comes back to create us as technologies, as Heidegger established. So we shape something, and then it comes back to shape us. So we're going to take on a fourth thesis, which is that writing is technological. This seems sort of radically uninteresting and pretty obvious. Anybody who's thought about it for any kind of time recognizes that writing is technological. Anytime you pull up a pen and paper, anytime you pull up a word processor and a keyboard, anytime you're looking at stone tablets or an e-book or something like that, you recognize very consciously that writing is technological. But again, we have to go back to what we were talking about the last few lectures. If we're not talking about technology as an object, we're talking about technology as a subject of study. And so when we say that writing is technological, we're not saying that writing is a technological process, which is obvious. We're talking that writing has a marked impact on who we are. So we create our technological writing tools, and then they come back to shape the way that we think and ultimately who we are and everything about our modern civilization, as we're going to see here in a second. So let's take a look at how this might work. The most baseline model is Plato's Critique. In the Phaedrus, he writes that the invention of writing will produce forgetfulness in the mind of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. And you have invented an elixir not of memory but of reminding, and you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom. So this is a good example. We're moving away from just simply that writing is a technological process, which is somewhat obvious, to writing actually changes the way that people think. So in other words, when I have my sticky pads, or I have my notes from my lecture, I have the ability to recall things that I wouldn't have been able to recall otherwise. So it's a memory tool. Now, this goes a little short of what writing actually does. A closer critique or a closer understanding, there's this next idea. This is a comic strip that was passed around our department a couple of years ago, back in 2015. And it's a pretty funny little comic strip, but it says that back in 1840, the modern bookworm is too busy reading about the world to look at it. 40 years later, no one talks anymore. We take our daily newspapers in silence. In 1910, the magazine is destroying conversation. In the 60s, television is putting into family discussion. In the 80s, the Walkman is creating antisocial behaviors. And by 2015, we become too absorbed in our phones to notice a dude. It's been 2 centuries. Take a hint. It's been much more than 2 centuries. Elizabeth Eisenstein, in her book, The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe, had this fantastic quote. It sort of demonstrates how things don't change as much as we think they actually change, despite the fact that it is having a marked impact on the way we think. And she writes, the complaints about the sullen silence of newspaper readers in the 17th century coffee houses point to the intrusive effects of printed materials on some form of sociability. So at least 400 years ago, people were commenting on the fact that people were showing up at their coffee houses with their newspapers and they weren't interacting with one another. They were sitting there in isolation in quote-unquote sullen silence. So we're getting a little closer to an effective critique or understanding of writing when we move away from it as a technological process to something that's impacting the way that we think or who we are. But let's take it a step further. Walter Ong does this in his 1980 book, Orality and Literacy, the technologizing of the word. Walter Ong is famous for a number of reasons. He was the president of the Modern Languages Association for a year. If you're familiar with MLA citation guides, then you're familiar with the Modern Languages Association. Walter Ong was a Jesuit priest, which makes him an interesting character to understand in terms of his impact on biblical studies. And most notably, Walter Ong was educated by Walter McLuhan. And if you're not familiar with Walter McLuhan, we'll talk about him next week, but he's famous for the saying that the medium is the message. And McLuhan was the mentor of Walter Ong when McLuhan was in his young 30s and Ong was working on his master's thesis at St. Louis University. So interestingly enough, Walter Ong and Marshall McLuhan were contemporaries even if they had a mentor-mentee relationship. So the conclusion of Walter Ong's thesis in Orality and Literacy in 1982 is simply this, is that writing provides for consciousness if nothing else does. We'll explore how that works in a minute. But a simple quote here is that an oral culture simply does not deal in such terms as geometrical figures, abstract categorization, formally logical reasoning processes, definitions, or even comprehensive description, or articulated self-analysis, all of which derive not simply from thought itself, but from text-formed thought. So what we're getting here is this. The average person thinks that you have orality, like a baby's learning how to speak, and then we simply just place on top of that literacy. And so somebody who has learned how to speak, learns how to read, and the only change that's taken place is that they now have the ability to take that speech and put it into characters and put it on a page and read it back as a memory aid device, which then possibly changes the way that we think in very subtle ways, such as making us forget things. This is just simply not the case. What Walter Ong is arguing is that a number of things emerge from the technology of writing that we never would have had otherwise. He says an oral culture did not have these things. They don't have geometric figures or geometry. They don't have abstract categorization. They don't have the ability to create definitions of terms. They don't have dictionaries. They don't have articulated self-analysis, etc. So let's look at how this works. This is the first example, pulled out of chapter 3. Ong argues that for an oral culture, thought processes are quote-unquote additive, and for literate culture, thought processes are subordinate. If you're familiar with the rhetorical terms parataxis or hypotaxis, this might help you understand what the difference is. Now, I've highlighted a few words here in case you're not radically familiar with grammatical terminology to help you understand this process. So this is a version of the Bible back in 1610 that's translated from the Latin, and it has a very strong root in the original oral tradition. And it says the following: in the beginning God created heaven and earth. A short opening sentence of about 7 or 8 words. Then the beginning of a new sentence with the presence of the coordinating conjunction and the earth was void and empty, comma, another coordinating conjunction turning this into a compound sentence, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, semicolon, with another coordinating conjunction, and the Spirit of God moved over the waters, period, another coordinating conjunction, and God said, be light made, period, another coordinating conjunction, and light was made, period, short, simple sentence. So the parataxis style is an additive style. You start here, and you simply add on a new line, and a new line, and a new line. And it becomes a very sort of, I would say, simplistic form of thinking. If you listen to children talk, sometimes they'll go off in this kind of additive style thinking. They'll start talking and they'll just go off on tangents. For instance, I went to the store today, I saw a bunny rabbit. Bunny rabbit was cute. I love bunny rabbits, etc., etc. And it's just sort of this It's additive style, and there's no connection between the ideas except that associative connection that's being made in the brain in real time. That's parataxis, and it's a very childlike style. We would look at that and we would say that's not very sophisticated writing. Assuming it wasn't the Bible that we're quoting, right? But we would look at that and we'd say this is not a very sophisticated passage. So we turned it into, in 1970, with the New American Bible, a subordinate or a hypotaxis style. It works like this. You'll notice that the words when, while, and then are bolded, indicating the presence, at least here and here, of a subordinating conjunction. A subordinating conjunction turns ideas less into a linear way of thinking and more into a hierarchical form of thinking. So in other words, there's an idea and there's an idea that's subordinated to that idea. Main idea, subordinated idea. It works in this sentence by the following mechanism. It says, when God created the heavens and the earth, comma, the earth was a formless wasteland, comma. The main clause in the sentence is this. The earth was a formless wasteland. And then with the presence of the coordinating conjunction, a second main idea, darkness covered the abyss. So if someone was to grammatically parse out this sentence, you would say that two things are happening. The earth was a formless wasteland, and darkness covered the abyss. Two main ideas. Now everything else surrounding it is now subordinated because of the presence of the subordinating conjunction. There's secondary ideas that help us make sense of the primary ideas. When God created the heavens and the earth, the when indicates a timing issue. It's no longer a main idea. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. It's only there to indicate the timing of when the main clause took place. The earth was a formless wasteland. So it changes entirely the way that you read this particular passage just based on the grammatical structure you've employed. Now, literate cultures see this, the subordinated or hypotaxis style, as being much more sophisticated and representative of somebody who has complicated thoughts as opposed to the parataxis style. It's somebody who is oral versus literate. Here's another example. I asked for the reader to do this at home, or not the reader, the audience to do this at home. Look at these four words. Hammer, saw, log, hatchet. One of them doesn't belong. Which one is it? If you are in a literate culture, you think abstractly. And so your answer would be, of course, the log doesn't belong. Why? Because we're going to categorize things in an abstract category. Hammer, saw, and hatchet are all tools that work on the log, but they are not the log itself. So we would say the hammer, the saw, and the hatchet all belong into a big abstract category that we place above it called tools that work with wood. And the log itself is an example of wood. Now, if you ask this question of people who are in primarily oral societies, in other words, they've never been exposed to literature, any type of form of writing, they would say other things. Here's an example from one person's train of thought. He said that, in fact, the hatchet doesn't belong, and here's why. He said that the log is primary. You can't do anything to wood without having wood. And so the log is necessary to the equation. And if I'm going to build something with that log, I need a hammer to join things together. I need a saw to make well-defined cuts. And the hatchet is the odd one out because the hatchet makes ill-defined cut. And so if I'm going to chunk one of these four, it's the hatchet that gets the axe. To be punny. So the hammer, the saw, and the log belong together because they belong together in a specific situation. And so they're thinking, it's a very rational kind of way of thinking, right? You can't do anything with these three tools, so you need a log. So the log can't be excluded. That is situational thinking. In this situation, I need a log and I need tools to work with that log, and the one that's going to go is the one that is least effective at what it does, which is the hatchet. So it's not simply that we have somebody who's oral and we have somebody else who's literate. It's that when somebody takes on a literate mindset, it changes entirely how they conceive of the world. These are just two examples. They think it in terms of subordinating ideas, big ideas, main ideas, and secondary ideas. And they think in terms of abstract categories as opposed to situational thinking. Well, again, who the heck cares? That's interesting. So writing changes us a little bit, not so much. In chapter 5, he goes a little step further and says that with the printing press, it has a marked impact on just about everything that we do. It has an impact on language with the presence of dictionaries, which creates a stagnation in language growth. It creates and preserves dead languages, such as Latin, but at the same time it allows for us to have a universal language, such as we use Latin for scientific categories. It has an impact on the way that we think, specifically by turning us away from an oral culture to a visual culture, what we can see. And so words become visual objects as opposed to auditory objects, and so thereby thinking becomes visual, and we look at books such as this one as an object of analysis, and it's something that I've got the definitive copy of, and if you disagree with what I've said, I can open page 45, we can look at the text together and have a close textual analysis. So it has a way of impacting the way that we think. He argues that indexes and lists and graphs and tables and other ways of organizing information, including white space, are only available because of the printing press. It has an impact on the way that we conceive of property, for instance, by discussing plagiarism and copyright issues, so that a book implies that somebody owns these ideas. After all, there's a person's name on here. He wrote this. He owns this, and so he has the copyright on it. Whereas in an oral culture, it's just everybody shares and shares alike. In fact, the more I share my ideas, the more that you gain something from that, as opposed to me hoarding and keeping those ideas for myself. Reading becomes private and isolated. It impacts everything about the way that knowledge accumulation and dissemination works. Interestingly enough, he says that printing creates an assembly line method for text, alphabetical text, that predates long before Henry Ford did so for the car. Creates a scientific way of thinking and create textbooks that codify that science into these are the facts of this field. You must learn, memorize, regurgitate. So let me give you an example of how this works in 2017. So this is all very interesting, right? But ultimately it's only useful insofar as it changes our day-to-day lives. So let me talk about it in terms of media theory. Specifically in the context of lip reading. As most of you out there know, I have a high-frequency hearing impairment. I've had that probably since birth, but I was quote-unquote diagnosed when I was 5 years old. And I have a high-frequency hearing impairment, which means that I hear a low sound normally, but not the high-frequency sounds that are in every sound that we make. Now, lip reading is a way of compensating for that which I don't quite hear. If I don't hear something accurately, no problem. I can read somebody's lips and I can get a semblance of what they're saying, right? Mathematically speaking, it doesn't work out very well. There's too many what's called homophones in the English language where sounds look alike on the mouth, so that lip reading should only be about 30% accurate. The classic example is this one. I'm going to mouth a sentence to you and see if you can figure out what I just said. Once again. The B and the M look identical on the mouth. Assuming you could have figured out what I was saying, I said, "Will you bury me?" Assuming you could figure out what I said, you probably assume that I said, "Will you marry me?" Of course, I have a wife already. But if I was to change the context and get down on one knee, and I can't do that in my office because I don't have enough space with the camera, but if I was to get down on my knee and I hold up a ring to you and I say, then you can quickly extrapolate the information from that and assume that I'm saying, "Will you marry me?" Because that's what people do. They hold up rings as a cultural symbol, universally so, at least in America. So I see that and I know exactly what you mean. So it's not very accurate. We should not be able to use lip reading to successfully have any kind of communicative abilities. 30% accurate is horrible. If you're familiar with 2001: A Space Odyssey, that famous scene where HAL 9000 is reading the lips of the main character, knowing that he's about to be shut down, so he takes preemptive measures to avoid that. The attempt to create that type of technology by analyzing visual information has been somewhat good, somewhat bad. It's on par with what humans can do, but there is no commercially available technology that does it successfully. Culturally, most people are sort of aware that there's lip reading going on. We all do it on some very small level. But the most obvious example of people being aware of it is NFL games where somebody's calling a play and they cover up their mouth so that we don't know what's being said. In fact, one of my teachers back in Amarillo was completely deaf, but he was a fairly effective lip reader, very effective. And when he was playing, I believe, high school football, he was able to figure out what plays were being called and tell their teammates, and they had a market advantage, even if you think, as I do, that that's cheating. Children, of course, in studies have been shown to be able to read lip. If you play an audio file in conjunction with somebody's mouth moving, they will pay attention to it. If you make the two out of sync, so that what's being said is not matching up with what's happening on the mouth, then the children will stop paying attention. They get disinterested very quickly. So children are able to at least recognize that the sounds that are coming out of my mouth are being made by my mouth, which is fairly remarkable. And we forget that people are doing lip reading pretty constantly. So, big tangent, what does this all mean? Well, it means this. Notice the word reading here. We've been talking about this idea of literacy trumping and overturning and completely changing the way that we think of language. And when we apply this metaphor of literacy to lip reading or speech reading, we end up with a radically wrong understanding of how lip reading actually works. Let me explain how that happened. If you were to assume that writing is the primary model for communications, it works pretty straightforward. A person, the author, has written a text, this book, for a reader, me, so that we can have a specified response. In this case, this video lecture that I'm recording. It's a pretty straightforward model, but it only works specifically in print culture. Consider if we extrapolate this idea of writing to an oral situation, well then you have just simply a speaker presenting a speech to an audience so that the audience can have a specified decision to be made at the end of it, such as who to vote for or who to elect. Now, if we apply that model, that very baseline simplified model, to lip reading, what we would assume is as simple as this, that a speaker is making mouth movement that we read as an audience so that we can have understanding. It doesn't work that way. Let me give you an example based on my own experiences of how lip reading actually takes place. It's not reading. There is no reading taking place. It's a complex inner exchange between the speaker, the listener, and the context. In essence, this is an extreme rhetorical activity. Let me explain how that works. So take yourself as a listener, imagine that you're deaf. People who have a history of hearing prior to becoming deaf are better lip readers than those who have no history of hearing. Your literacy level dictate how much you can understand in terms of lip reading. How many times you've been exposed to that context matters. So if I've never been to a football game before and all of a sudden I'm hearing or seeing the word touchdown and field goal being displayed on somebody's lip, I don't know what words those are unless I have, for instance, literacy that backs that up, or I have potential previous contextual experience with that idea. The intelligence level, your IQ has an impact, your innate ability has an impact. My older sister has the same hearing impairment as I do. She's a better lip reader than I am, unequivocally so. It depends on how active or passive you are as a listener in the process. Sometimes I will focus much more intently than other times, and when I focus very hard, typically I can get more than when I'm not focused. And it really has a big impact on your energy levels. After doing this for several hours each day, you get sleepy and tired, and it's very difficult to overcome that mental hurdle because your mind is having to work overtime. The speaker, assuming they know anything about deafness, they can accommodate. Their knowledge of lip reading can impact how they perform. But most importantly, consider these things: that their mouth movements have a marked impact on whether or not we can read their lip. Their volume, if they're talking too quiet, it makes it more difficult. How much facial hair they have. People with really thick beards with mustaches that overhang their lips obscures the ability to see. And then obviously people who cover their mouth. I had students who, they would chew on pens and pencils, and they were talking like this, and I have no idea what they're saying. So obviously the speaker's awareness of this issue has an impact. And then, of course, the context has an impact: the noise, the outside noise, the white noise, the support technologies, what the acoustics in the room, how many other people are in the room talking, so if there's an abundance of speakers and listeners, and then, of course, the distance between the two people. So a better understanding of lip, quote-unquote, reading is that it has nothing to do with reading whatsoever, and anybody who takes that word and applies it from a literate mindset assumes that somebody who's deaf just needs to sit there, read my lip, and they get the idea, they learn from the ideas, and they move on. And it doesn't work that way. Lip reading is massively complicated, it's extremely time-consuming, it's difficult to do. You have to read a lot to overcome for your deficiencies. You have to work constantly at it to get better at lip reading. You learn from each person's lip movements, and everybody has a different mouth entirely. So it's complicated, horribly complicated. And because we think in terms of literacy, we assume that something like lip reading is relatively simple. One final example, this is from one of my mentors back at Texas Tech, Sean Zdenek, who wrote a book called Reading Sound. He has a website to correspond with the book. But he talks about closed captioning for hearing impaired or deaf individuals, or other people who like to use closed captioning, such as my parents do when they watch TV. They want to hear the whispers and whatnot of the content. The assumption when we apply to closed captioning is the exact same assumption that we apply to lip reading, which is that it's a simplified model, that somebody who is going to be a closed captioner simply needs to do one thing. You take the auditory content and you transcribe it, meaning you have a written transcript or a script of what's been said. And it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't seem like a complicated activity. However, it's massively complicated. Here's a simple example. He has hundreds of examples in his book. Take the movie Taken with Liam Neeson. I won't give out any spoilers on the movie if you haven't seen it, but obviously somebody gets taken. When they get reunited at the end, there's a PA announcement that comes on in the background that says this airport does not sponsor their activity. It's very quiet, and it completely interrupts the emotional impact of the reunion. And more importantly, it has this sense of irony because it's saying this airport does not sponsor their activities, implying that the airport is not sponsoring the activities of the people who took the person who was taken. So when you're writing out closed captioning, you are not transcribing information. You are making rhetorical decisions and choices about what is important and what is not important. Not every sound can be captioned. You have the sound of a shirt rustling. Is that important enough to caption? Only if the sound has some kind of an impact in the movie. Possibly if you're in a horror flick and we need to know that that sound is about to make an impact on the presence of an individual who's in the dark, maybe it matters. But otherwise, you're going to be captioning constantly sounds that are irrelevant to the overall meaning, the rhetorical meaning of the movie. And so a captioner has an extreme amount of power about what goes into this. And when they assume that it's as simple as I'm just transcribing what's been said, it's as simple as that, type, 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 listen, 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 type, 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 we have a bad understanding of how the oral transforms into the literate. So let's wrap up. This is already too long as it is. So the argument is simple, that writing is obviously technological. We're not talking about technology as objects. We're talking about this idea that writing has a marked impact on the way the human mind works and how we think. It does so in very simple ways, like memory aid devices and whatnot, but more importantly, it changes us entirely in terms of how we think, including adding new things that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise, such as abstract thinking, hypertaxis, styles of writing, and other big things like dictionaries and scientific communication and white space and whatnot. So when we get back next week, what we're going to talk about is how something very simple, like the alphabet, which is a specified technology of writing, has an even bigger impact. In fact, as we'll see next week, Robert Logan argues that the alphabet is responsible for the entirety of Western civilization. Too big of a claim? We'll find out. All right, I'm done. Goodbye.